Hey everyone, great to see everybody here today and lots of people that we know coming back. So if you don't know me, I'm Peter Askim. I'm the artistic director of the next Festival of Emerging Artists. And this is the second day now of our festival 2020. So when the pandemic hit in March, we decided to step right in, and we've been doing events twice a week since March with great guest artists, master classes, and workshops. As a festival, what we try and do is provide all of the tools that a young artist needs to succeed in a career today. And whether that's artistic things or business things or entrepreneurship. And so with our festival, we've got over 20 guest artists lined up for the next 4 weeks. We have events on Tuesdays and Thursday afternoons in Eastern Time. And we've tried to assemble kind of an all-star dream cast of artists, business people, workshop leaders to give you, young artists, all of the tools that you need to create a career, especially in the times that we're living in today, which are incredibly complicated. But we're so grateful to have many guest artists to join us. And we're so grateful that you're tuning in, and we hope that this can all be helpful for you. And so today I wanted to welcome Elaine Grogan Luttrull. She is the head of Minerva Financial Arts. And I think as a young artist, as an old artist, as an artist, we don't really know very much about uh, money, frankly. So I wanted to bring her in. She's done a lot of work with finances in the arts and run a lot of workshops. She is going to be a great resource for us over the next 3 weeks. She's doing 3 workshops, all on Thursdays at this time. If you found us here, then you can find us again next Thursday and the Thursday after that. Her workshops will cover a bunch of different topics, including a portfolio, career, and taxes. And today she's going to be doing a talk on 5 steps to building an exceptional budget. So without further ado, I would like to invite Elaine to start speaking. And thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today. Thank you for joining. I know talking about budgeting isn't always the most exciting part of thinking about how your musical career will unfold, but I am really excited to be joining and having this conversation with you today. It's an incredible time in our country, certainly, and it's an even more incredible time to think about the financial impacts of the career you have chosen. I think there are absolutely vital things creative individuals, especially musicians, will be doing to ensure that the next couple of years in our country look the way we want them to, as opposed to the way they have looked historically. And I'm excited to give you some tools today to make sure that you are taking care of your own financial situation so that you can do whatever you want to change the world. Because if you never have to say yes to something you'd rather say no to just for the money, you win. And that is my goal for each of you. And being very mindful and intentional around your money by using a budget is a really good way to get there. As Peter said, my name is Elaine. I am a CPA. Of course, all of this information is just educational, though. I'm not giving you legal, tax, or accounting advice, but you probably knew that. I'm also a personal financial specialist, so we can talk about retirement strategies and investing. And then I'm an accredited financial counselor. And a few years ago, I finished a program in financial therapy. So I like to tell my clients that I can hand you tissues while we cry about taxes and budgeting and pricing strategies and all those other things, because money is hard and it's about so much more than just adding up dollars and cents. Nevertheless, I am the luckiest money person ever because all of my work is with creative organizations all around the country, helping individuals, creative artists of all different disciplines, master the business and financial side of their creativity. So what I'd like to do today, in addition to talk about budgeting, is make sure we're covering a couple of ground rules and parameters. We want to make sure everyone is sharing the floor with respect. There is a chat feature within Zoom. I am very confident you are all Zoom masters now, since we've been doing Zoom and virtual meetings now for quite a few weeks. So if you'd like to use the chat feature, you can send me messages while I'm talking. I'll keep an eye on that. That is a great way to ask any questions you might have, ask for some clarification, or even to share some of your own experiences as they relate to what we're talking about. We are all equal parts teachers and learners in this space. That means you all are experts in your own experiences. So there's a good chance something I say will resonate really well with you, and I hope it does. Grab onto that and take that with you. But if I say something else and it doesn't really make sense for you, leave that here. You are the expert in your own experience, so you get to decide what parts of what we'll discuss you carry with you. And speaking of carrying those parts with you, we want to make sure that stories stay within this space. This is being recorded, so I would caution you to remember that this is being recorded, but also know that if someone does share their own experience or stories or questions in the chat, remember those are that person's stories to share. By all means, take the lessons from those stories and experiences and use those lessons in your own lives, but definitely make sure the stories stay within this space. If you have any other ground rules you'd like to make sure to add, go ahead and feel free to add them into the chat right now. So what we're doing is talking about budgeting, but it would be silly to talk about budgeting without acknowledging this moment where we are, which is probably within some sort of recession, right? Probably also in a world that's facing a lot of uncertainty, specifically related to the coronavirus pandemic and the impact that will have on funding in the arts, specifically performing arts, for probably a long period of time. So what I wanted to talk through today was the 5-step budgeting process I generally teach in general, but also how that applies to this moment in time and how you can use that process to build your own personal and business budgets and connect that to your own personal and creative goals. Now, many of you may not necessarily think of yourselves as business people, and that's totally fine. But from a tax perspective, if you are doing any sort of freelance type of work, so you're gigging or you're performing as a 1099 person, or you have a regular kind of performance option, or even you're teaching lessons, say out of your home or in any context where you are not an employee or an employee of someone else, then that makes you a business in the eyes of the IRS. So thinking about what your budget looks like from that business perspective is pretty important as well. And as I mentioned, this is all educational today. So I like to kind of start by talking about what a budget is not. If we were doing this in person, I would ask you to share some ideas about what a budget is and is not. But to spare you from unmuting yourself and contributing, I wanted to share that a budget is not a list of paid expenses. It is really important to be mindful and intentional about how you spend your money, and looking back at what you have spent previously is a great way to do that. But that's not a budget. A budget, by definition, looks forward instead of backwards. So it's definitely not just a list of expenses. And it's also not an exercise in math. A budget is much more about problem solving and creatively connecting dots and identifying paths to get to the end result you want, as opposed to a math exercise. And it's also not an exercise in delusional optimism, although sometimes it can be fun to budget from a delusionally optimistic perspective. Your budget, though, has to be rooted in reality for it to be useful to you. And that means having a realistic acknowledgement of both your time and the constraints on your resources. There are some things that are outside of your control when it comes to how you spend your time and how you spend your money. So making sure you're considering those as you build a useful budget for you is going to be really important. So what is a budget? A budget is a financial plan for allocating resources. That's it. 3 parts to that definition. There's the planning part, the allocating part, that's the spending part, and the resources part, that's the income part. And all 3 of those parts are really important, and they work together. Your budget is going to be wrong by definition, right? It is imperfect. It is a projection about something that may or may not happen exactly in the way you think it will. So the sooner you get comfortable with this idea of using a budget as kind of a flexible tool, as opposed to as a process for measuring whether or not you reach something, the easier budgeting will be. And the purpose of the budget is to help you reach your goal. It's not meant to be an exercise in, seeing if you did well or did poorly on something, right? It's not a critical exercise. It's a tool to help you reach wherever you want to go. So with that in mind, the first step in building a budget is to define the parameters. And I find, especially among arts organizations, this is the step that is almost always skipped, right? By the way, that's true for individuals too, but especially if any of you work for major colleges or universities or arts organizations or performing groups that are organized as 501c3s, you know that sometimes this step gets skipped. But it's important that you not skip it, because you have to understand exactly what it is you are budgeting and why. Because if you don't understand that, it's really hard to make decisions about what makes sense within that budget and to evaluate whether or not the budget is moving you in the right direction. And sometimes we get kind of lazy. We start with a budget that may have existed last year or the year before, and we just try to update it a little bit. But that misses out on this huge opportunity to actually define the future that you want by defining the parameters of your budget. So what do I mean by parameters? Generally, I mean these things that are presented on your screen. You want to make sure there's some sort of goal embedded in the budget, and we like goals to be specific and measurable and time-bound. We humans tend to really like deadlines associated with budgets and all sorts of other things. So definitely keep that in mind as you are drafting the goal of your budget. And then it's also important to understand what's the time frame that you're looking at when it comes to this budget. Right now, most individuals and organizations are looking at very short-term budgets. Why? Because there is tremendous uncertainty about what the fall and next spring will look like in terms of what sort of activities will be permitted and supported and what types of accommodations we'll need to make to adjust for social distancing guidelines, personal protective equipment, or anything else that might come up as we think about how we normally do what we do. So right now, most people are focused on very short-term budgets. But you can also have a more medium-term budget that looks out, say, a year, maybe a little bit longer, and then a long-term budget that looks out 3 to 5 years into the future, right? I would say if you're looking out 3 to 5 years right now, do it in pencil. That's probably always good advice, but that is especially good advice now. And it's not a bad idea to be looking out that far into the future, but just know that you can't predict with any level of certainty what that future is going to look like. So make sure you're allowing yourself the flexibility there to be wrong. It's also interesting to think about whether whatever it is you're budgeting for is a one-time thing or something that's going to happen either on an ongoing basis or more than once. So if it is a one-time project or performance, your commencement recital, for example, that might only be something you do once, right? That is a one-time project, a one-time budget you are going to build. But it's also possible that you'll think about undertaking something that you want to do more than once. I think a festival like this one is a great example of that. It repeats annually, right, or regularly. So there is some learning that kind of goes into it, but it's not necessarily something that continues all 12 months out of the year, right? So if you were thinking about summer residencies or festivals or other things like that, there's a good chance there might be kind of periodic projects you might undertake. And it's important to understand that as a framework, as part of the parameter of the budget for that periodic project. It's also possible you will have budgets that are ongoing. So if you think about your life as a human or your life as a musician, that would be an ongoing budget. You are going to basically have similar expenses on an ongoing basis. If it's personal, we're thinking about rent or mortgage, food, clothing, shelter, social needs, all of those human type of experiences that will be ongoing. If we're thinking about you as a professional musician, you're going to have training, you're probably going to have advertising, you might have insurance on your instrument. There will be ongoing expenses that you will continue, right? So it's important to kind of understand what's the frequency of this budget that you are building, because some things may or may not make sense within a budget depending on what you're budgeting for. And lastly, the nature of the budget is important. Is it personal or is it professional or is it a little of both? That's something you get to decide, but it's important that you're very clear on what it is you are budgeting. My suggestion would be to keep separate personal budgets from professional budgets, but if you are still a student, that's going to be next to impossible. And as you are evolving in your career, those lines might be very, very blurry. But to the extent possible, I'd encourage you to be very aware about which world you're in. If it's a totally personal world, if it's a totally professional world, or if it's somewhere in between. As you know, of course, in a normal situation, we would define our parameters and then we would move on with the steps. But we're not in a normal situation right now. What I'm seeing right now among organizations and individuals is a focus on scenario planning. And this is the idea that as you are defining those parameters, you are basically saying, okay, maybe I'm building a budget for the next 6 months for my musical career, and I have no idea what those next 6 months will look like. So the solution is not to just not budget, it's to plan for maybe 4 different scenarios of what the next 6 months could look like so that you can adjust accordingly. And so that you can use this budget as an opportunity, maybe to evaluate some new ideas about things that might make sense for you in the next 6 months. There's probably no shortage of individuals sharing ideas with you about how you can continue to be creative during this time, whether that is moving lessons online via Zoom, or whether it is doing private concerts via Zoom, or whether it is socially distanced performances and what that might look like, right? Plenty of people will be sharing ideas with you. That doesn't mean they're all good. But if you have sort of a framework of the different scenarios that might unfold, that can help you evaluate the ideas and identify the 1 or 2 that actually really might make sense for you. These are what some of the common scenarios I'm seeing look like. There tends to be one scenario that is very optimistic. In fact, for some individuals, that might look like what a normal fall season would look like if we were not in the midst of a global pandemic and tremendous change in our country, right? So that might be one scenario. A different scenario at the opposite end of the spectrum might assume that you will have little or no revenue until maybe next fall, so fall of 2021. So this would be the scenario where all venues remain closed and online options really are not producing any sort of sustainable revenue for you or your community, which means you're probably looking at some emergency funding sources, maybe some of those emergency grants or other sort of unrelated income to your main creative activity. That's kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum where you're looking at a year-ish with no predictable income. And then the last 2 scenarios we're seeing tend to fall in the middle. Maybe one says, okay, fall's going to happen, but it's going to be really reduced. So you're counting on considerably less income for the fall. And then another scenario might be, okay, fall is reduced and maybe spring is reduced as well, but then things start to pick up. These aren't sort of magical scenarios that you have to follow, but it is a way of thinking about what would normal kind of look like for you. Are you regularly performing in the fall? Is December your busiest month? What if no events happen then? What does that look like, right? It's a way of looking at these different options and sort of mapping out different scenarios, because our elected officials and frankly, the unfolding of the virus will let us know which of these scenarios becomes more realistic. And if you've been kind of planning for any of them, you can adjust more quickly. A question that has come up among lots of individuals I've been working with is, what time frame am I supposed to be looking at? Under normal circumstances, I'd challenge you to look at maybe a 1-year time frame, and I'm still not opposed to that. Although, realistically, if you are building a budget right now, focus on the next 3 months. Maybe look at the next 3 to 6 months. But realistically, it's going to be hard to look much further than that in the future. The one exception would be if you already have some things that are booked or maybe at least tentatively marked on the calendar into that future, right? Then I would make sure that you're at least considering whether those things are going to be canceled, modified, or continued as if we were under normal circumstances. But if you are in a position where you are kind of charting your own course and you don't have a whole lot of things nailed down beyond 6 months, I think looking 3 to 6 months is probably a good idea. One of the reasons I love starting with parameters is because defining the parameters is crucially important. It is asking too much of a budget to have it meet every single need you might have as a creative human, right? Because you have human needs and professional needs and creative needs and other needs that don't fit nicely into any category. So definitely get comfortable with the idea of building multiple budgets that serve different purposes, and with building budgets that take into account different scenarios right now, especially when there is so much uncertainty in the world. So that's the first step. Define the parameters. What are you budgeting? The second step is to list all of the expenses in words that are associated with that parameter. So for example, words that might come to mind if you were building a personal budget, we've touched on some of these: food, clothing, shelter, transportation. What are your transportation needs? What about utilities? What sort of connectivity issues do you have, or social needs do you have? What sort of support do you need as a human? And what does that look like in your budget? And then also, are there insurance needs that you have as a human? Or what other protections are you incorporating in your budget? You might have debt payments in this category as well. Maybe you have student loan payments that are currently paused because of the CARES Act, but those payments are going to restart again at some point. So what do those words look like, right, when they make sense in your budget? If you're building a professional budget, your words might be a little different. You probably have some creative expenses. Maybe that is maintenance of your instrument. Maybe it's subscriptions to different services you find it vital to subscribe to. Maybe it is travel for auditions or for performances, or even for research. And maybe it is research itself that is a crucial expense to you. Maybe you have professional development, maybe you have lessons that you maintain, or maybe you attend master classes, or you pay to attend different professional development events. And again, you probably have some sort of insurance, probably on your instrument, maybe liability insurance if you are hosting your own performances, or maybe any other type of insurance that makes sense for you, the business person. Again, these are just the words, and the mind frame I want you to be in as you are brainstorming these words is a very open one, where you essentially just start with a blank sheet of paper and you write down all the words you think of that make sense for either you as a human or you as a creative professional. And maybe your budget includes both of those things. So maybe you mix the words. That's okay. As long as you are in sort of an open brainstorming kind of place, you can keep throwing out all the words. You can always erase them later or cross them out or delete them. That's okay. Don't start by eliminating the words though. Sometimes people are surprised that we get through the first 2 steps of the budgeting process. That's 40% of the process, so almost halfway through, and there are no numbers yet. And that's very intentional. Oftentimes when I'm working with creative individuals, there is a huge resistance to the idea of numbers or math. And I have to say, I don't see that nearly as much when working with musicians, because there is so much overlap between the beauty of math and the beauty of composition. But many of your creative peers aren't really crazy about math, which frankly has much more to do with the way we teach math in this country rather than anyone's ability to kind of process numbers, right? But a budget isn't about the numbers. It is a tool for problem solving and identifying and highlighting your values based on how you're allocating your resources. And it's a much more powerful tool if you let it not be about the numbers. We use numbers to quantify words, and we'll get to that, but budgets are not actually about the numbers. We do have to add them at some point, though, and that point is step 3. This is where you take that big open brainstorm list of all the words that make sense for whatever it is you're budgeting. And now we start adding numbers next to all of those words. And this is also the moment where I will remind you that your budget is supposed to be wrong. It is an imperfect document. So don't get hung up on making sure you have the absolute perfectly correct number to put next to the word, right? It's okay to put something down that's close, explain your thinking, and then move on, right? Don't let perfection create a barrier for you here. So again, if we were doing this in person, I would pause here and make you tell me different ways of figuring out how to quantify expenses. But for purposes of letting you relax on Zoom and not have to unmute yourself, I'll share what I typically hear in response to this question. The first and possibly best way to help quantify expenses is through your own personal experience. This is where looking back at your previous spending can be so helpful. In fact, when I'm working with individuals, very often one of the first questions I'll ask after we talk about what their creative pursuits are and what their big goals are, I'll ask the question, what does it cost you to exist as a human each month? And I'll challenge them to write down a number. And then part of our work together is looking back to see how close their estimate was to what they thought. And usually there are surprises because we're humans, right? We tell ourselves stories, and sometimes those stories match perfectly with reality, and sometimes they don't. But if you're looking at figuring out what's the right number to put in your budget for your cell phone bill each month, a fantastic way to research and figure out what that right number is to look at what you were charged by your cell phone provider last month. That's a really good way to add a number to some words in your budget. So if you have personal experience, definitely use it. Adjust it to make sure it still makes sense with the parameters you've outlined. But if you've got personal experience, use it. If you don't have any personal experience, you have experience of all the other humans around you. These can be your peers from any of your educational programs. These can be your friends, your colleagues, your mentors, your instructors, other individuals you're meeting as part of this particular festival, right? All of these individuals have experiences that are different than yours, which means if you are invited to attend a residency and you know someone who's done that residency before, that will be a fantastic resource to say, hey, what was the cheapest way to get around when you were at the residency? And how much did you spend on food each day? Were you surprised by anything that wasn't included, right? You can use the experiences of others to help you inform the numbers that make sense in your own budget. You're still in charge of it, right? You still get to decide what your numbers are, but you're not starting from scratch, even if you haven't had an experience yourself. And fostering the relationships that can provide that level of experience is so important. It's important from a creative perspective and a personal human perspective. And it's also really important from a financial perspective because you are not expected to have all the answers. Thank goodness. You can use your resources and build out some of that knowledge. And In the absence of your own personal experience or the experience from others, including peers, mentors, instructors, anyone else, you can always research. And I don't mean fancy academic level research. I mean going to Google and typing in, what does it cost to spend a summer in Maine, or whatever it is you happen to be budgeting for, right? The idea of being able to dive into the massive internet where other people have shared their experiences and do a little bit of research means you don't have to get stuck on figuring out what any of these numbers are. And that's really important, right? Because we know the numbers are going to be wrong. We want you to just do your best to pick out numbers that feel like they might be the most right and make the most sense for you and your parameters and your goals, and then use that to build your budget. This is not supposed to be perfect, right? But it's also not supposed to be delusionally optimistic. Remember, that was one of our opening parameters, where a budget is not delusionally optimistic. You are supposed to make valid, reasonable assumptions, and then make a note to yourself for where you found that information, because you're not going to remember months and months from now why you thought something would cost whatever you thought. But if you have some notes to help jog your memory, that will definitely help. But again, don't let perfect numbers be a barrier for you. I'll pause here to see if there are any questions. We've gone through the first 3 budgeting steps, where we define the parameters, we list the expenses in words, and then we quantify the expenses. Before I move on to the next step, I do want to just pause and see if there are any questions. I haven't seen any come through the chat. Stephanie shared a point about how this is a powerful way to think about budgeting, and I totally agree. But now's a really good time to put questions in the chat if you have any. All right. I'm going to keep going because I don't see any that have been added. By all means, add them there if you have additional questions, though. Step 4 is where we get to the revenue. And sometimes this surprises people because I start with expenses instead of starting with income. And we'll talk about why that's a better approach in a few minutes. But when we start adding the income, this is when your budget starts to sort of come together, including with those different scenarios that I outlined earlier. So this might be what a very high level budget for you might look like for the next couple of months. In the income section, you might have sales. If you're not selling work, you might not have any sales. You might have gigs or performance income, or choosing a different word that makes sense for you. You also might have some grants. You might have individual support. Maybe you have an account on Patreon and you have a membership type of model where individuals support you financially, right? That would be great. Maybe you have related income. Maybe you teach. Maybe what you really love to do is perform, but you also teach lessons. I would call that related income. And so you can project what level of income you might have under different scenarios in that category. And maybe you have unrelated income. Maybe you have another type of income in any sort of industry that doesn't really have anything to do with your craft, but it does provide a source of money. You can put that on here as well. I've also included a line here for emergency funding because we are in this insane moment right now. Many individual artists are drawing upon emergency funding sources. This could range from emergency artist relief grants. Artistrelief.org has been a fantastic supporter of some of those emergency grants. It could also be unemployment, or it could be the stimulus payments that went out if you were fortunate enough to receive one of those. So that doesn't necessarily fit really well in a different category. So I added its own category for this moment in time, and that's okay. But these are all different potential sources of income you might have, and you probably have a whole lot of other potential sources that aren't listed here, and that's okay. But once you have the words, whatever words make sense for you, we want to start thinking about what the numbers are associated with that income word, right? In each different scenario. I can tell you, if you typically perform maybe at fairs or festivals, and especially if that's a big part of your summer season, that revenue line has been impacted pretty tremendously because most of those events have been canceled, right? If you perform a lot during the fall, maybe you're seeing a world where some of those have been canceled and some have not. You can use what you're hearing from others in the field to help you plan out what revenue numbers can be reasonable in different categories. If most of what you do is online, whether that is teaching or whether that is in performing online, maybe you're doing okay. And maybe the revenue you're projecting on those lines is still about what you thought it would be, right? If you were very early to adapt to online teaching or online performing, you may have been in a really great position. Or maybe you're someone who has said, you know what? Performing online doesn't work for me. That is not something I'm going to do for X, Y, and Z creative reason. So maybe you just put 0 next to that revenue line. That's okay, as long as you're making an informed choice about what makes sense for you. If you typically have corporate gigs or other sort of performances or other engagements that are associated with major institutions, right? You can look closely and see how are those major institutions doing right now. Some are doing really well. Some have adapted and figured out really innovative new ways of continuing to serve their audience members. Others have not. They've gone a little bit more dormant, either for economic reasons or safety reasons, or a combination of all of those. If you teach, it's interesting to think about how the academic environment is responding. Maybe you are an adjunct instructor and you teach private lessons at a college or university in your area, right? Maybe you are waiting carefully to see if that's still going to be an option for you in the fall or if it's not. If you teach in a K-12 setting or in a community center setting or privately, you might have a little bit more control about how you manage some of those commitments. Again, this is all about looking carefully at the revenue and income streams that make sense for you, and then thinking about how they are impacted at this moment in time, so you can plan out some numbers that feel reasonable-ish given your 4 scenarios. If you receive funding from city or state sources, so maybe these are city level grants that you get regularly, maybe they are performance grants or travel grants or research grants, I think you should be prepared for those grants to be pretty heavily curtailed over the next couple of years or so. As we look around at our city and state income sources, cities and states aren't collecting a lot of revenue right now from income taxes because a number of individuals have been laid off, and they're not collecting a whole lot of revenue from sales taxes right now either because everyone's spending less money. The last data I saw in this said the average person is spending about 40% less right now than they spent a couple of months ago because we're not dining out as much. Maybe we're not leisurely shopping as much. We are prioritizing food, shelter, lodging, sort of core human needs right now. And that means our cities and states are collecting less tax revenue. And that tax revenue is often returned to the community through creative individual grants. So if that's a big part of how you fund your existence, that's definitely something you're going to want to look at pretty carefully, because I expect that'll be heavily hit for the next 18 months to 2 years or so. Also, if you have other sources of income, I listed here a part-time job with a not-for-profit, but it really could be any other types of income, any types of part-time or full-time work that you're using to support yourself financially. I think it's interesting to also consider what the impact on some of those numbers might be, because they're not looking really, really great right now, which is why this process of kind of looking at the numbers and confronting what reality is for you is an important thing to do. And I don't mean for this to be like a real downer part of the conversation, because my approach tends to be one of empowerment. So I do want to sort of remind us that the reason we're looking at all of this is so that we can make intentional, on-purpose decisions with the limited information we have. And budgeting is never quick or easy. And it's going to be especially slow right now because there is so much uncertainty and there are so many interesting numbers for you to digest. I have some of them here on the screen. There is a great report from Arts Fund about the impact of COVID-19. They estimate the arts sector can lose $135 million in revenue this year. So if you typically play for an orchestra that is hired for theatrical productions that pass through your town, all of those have been canceled for the rest of the year. If you're part of a chamber group that relies on performing out in bars or restaurants or at cultural sites, most of those things have been suspended right now, right? And that's happening across the artistic sector. 97% of organizations have canceled their programs, right? You're probably feeling that. And Americans for the Arts reported that the average artist, and I think they had about 16,000 or so artists in their survey, and these are artists from across all creative disciplines in the United States, but the average artist has lost about $24,000 of income. That's a pretty powerful number because the average earnings in the arts sector, according to National Endowment for the Arts, is about between $44,000 and $48,000 a year. Obviously, there are those that are doing better and those that are not doing quite that well, but that's a pretty solid average number of income. And if the average artist has lost $24,000 of income, that's almost half of what they would normally earn in a year. That's terrifying, right? And then you add on to that the unemployment figures that we are all familiar with, right? Over 30 million people have filed first-time unemployment claims over the past 8 weeks or so. That's pretty incredible. All of which is to say, this is not going to be a really quick process to just estimate what your income is going to be. It's going to be a slow, critical look at all of the different ways that you earn income and understand kind of what those ways might look like going forward. Question in the chat, would I recommend using accounting software, especially softwares like QuickBooks or Mint, which can sync with Intuit and your bank account? And then is it a better idea to link your bank account to software as opposed to doing manual entry? I love this question. Thanks so much, Anna, for raising it. Personally, I love a good accounting software, and I love when the software links to my bank account. Obviously, there are some security risks that come with that because you are essentially giving an outsider access to your bank account to pull some data. So any platform you're using where you're sort of syncing it up like that could be at risk for some theft of information. For me personally, I got comfortable with the level of security provided by QuickBooks specifically is what I use, and also my bank. And using that automatic syncing saves so much time. Now, here are the reasons that may not make sense for you. Number one, if you are just starting out, you might not have an extra $16 to $26 a month to spend on subscribing to an accounting service like QuickBooks. Mint is free. I find the data lag tends to be quite a bit slower with Mint. And also Mint is less easier to navigate and separate personal expenses from business ones. But you know, that's the trade-off that comes with paying for something versus not paying for something. I would also make sure you are comfortable understanding what any of the free providers are doing with your data because they are making money somewhere. So make sure you're comfortable with what they're doing with your data. I will also say there are platforms like FreshBooks. There's another one called You Need a Budget, or YNAB, as some of the kids call it. These are all really fantastic options. And when you're evaluating different options, it's important to understand what the system does, what protections they have in place, and if you really need it. When I was just starting out, I started this business in 2016 7, 8, 9-ish. I guess 2009 might be the official start. But when I was first starting out, I did not have any extra dollars to spend on an accounting system. So I used Excel, Google Sheets, or Numbers. If you're a Mac user, any of these options can work really well. And one thing you can do, it's not quite as seamless as syncing something to QuickBooks, but you can export data from your bank account into a CSV file. And if you export it into a CSV file, then you can just copy and paste it into Excel or Google Sheets or Numbers. And that can save you a lot of data entry work and also give you the flexibility to kind of categorize expenses differently. Whatever you choose to do, though, make sure it works for you, right? If you are choosing something based on the aspirational version of yourself that is totally and completely organized and on top of everything, but you know that the realistic version of yourself is probably going to manage this quarterly or so, you want to make sure those two things are in line, right? And so I am all for starting with a very lean, free manual option while you get a sense of exactly what you need. But if you're someone that is never going to open Google Sheets, you might prefer something like FreshBooks that is very easy to look at, that is budget friendly, although not free, and that also enables you to send invoices. So you also want to be looking at the different features of these platforms and figuring out which ones really, really make sense for you. So I just need more money is not a valid business plan. It can be very tempting to say that at this moment in time, especially if you are kind of putting your budget together and you're looking at some of these revenue items that have been pretty severely impacted, and you're looking at some of your expenses and realizing there's not a lot of room to cut any of those expenses. It can be tempting to just say, well, I just need more money, but that's not a business plan. It is much more impactful to translate that need into some actionable steps. One question that I have gotten, especially from the performing arts community, including musicians, is thinking about approaching corporate partners or new funders right now and what that looks like. And the advice I've been giving tends to be focus on what has changed about how you do what you do, and also what has not changed. If you specialize in providing crucially emotionally powerful connections to other humans through music, that may not have changed. You might still be doing that, although you might be doing it through a different channel, and that's okay. But I think as you're thinking about having these conversations with corporate partners or other new funders, it is important to acknowledge that some of what you do has not changed. The need for human connection and appreciation for the arts hasn't changed. That will never change, right? But understanding the value associated with it may have changed a little bit right now. I'd also encourage you to focus your efforts on potential partners that have the ability to support you right now. If you look at sort of the economy as a whole lot of people are hurting. Very few people are just thriving right now, right? But there are some industries that are hurting less than others. When we look at our distributors, companies like Amazon or FedEx, those companies are doing okay. They've had kind of a boon in distribution lately that's been helping them. Financial industries are also doing okay. Many of them have been vital in processing some of the small business loans and the Paycheck Protection Program lately. They're doing okay. Our grocery stores are doing okay. So as you think about what potential partners in your own community might make sense, it's interesting to think about targeting groups that are doing okay right now, and then think about targeting them in a really holistic way so that you think about mutual benefits to some sort of sponsorship. And as you're looking at your numbers, particularly from the income side, and maybe looking at some tough realities with those numbers, it's very tempting to think about all sorts of different ways of making money. And I am all for creativity in doing that, right? But I would also encourage you to go back to what you do really, really well. You know what you do really, really well. You know what makes you special and different from other individuals. Go back to that and see if there's an opportunity to use those strengths that really distinguish you to connect with existing clients or customers in a slightly different way, or to connect with new clients and customers. But you need to understand what those clients and customers need right now. And don't guess about this. Make sure you are really understanding what they need and you have some sort of data to support that, even if that is you having conversations with your current students and getting some feedback, right? Don't make your decisions in a vacuum, because that can often lead you to spending a whole lot of time on something that your clients and customers don't actually want, right? And that is not a good use of your time right now. But do understand what they need, talk to them, get some valuable feedback, and think about how you can match your own strengths with those opportunities right now. And then I would also challenge you to think about whatever those opportunities are. Think about how you can use each opportunity to then lead you to the next opportunity, right? We are in sort of a short-term mindset right now, especially because we don't really know what 6 months from now will look like, right? So to the extent that you have an opportunity, I definitely be very mindful about using it to connect to a future opportunity. So what could that look like? Let's say you're a musician and you have an opportunity, a nonprofit in your area has moved to a virtual gala, as many are doing, and they've invited you to do some sort of performance at the virtual gala, right? So there's going to be a moment where you are performing in some sort of virtual environment, and hopefully you are going to be paid for that performance. You should be paid for that performance. And think about how you can use that to then lead it to something else. Do you get a copy of the recording of that that you can then share with someone else that might hire you for a virtual performance? Do you get a feedback quote from the executive director of the nonprofit that says something like, so-and-so's performance transformed our gala into the most amazing thing ever, or something like that? Do you have an opportunity to invite 3 or 4 people to this virtual gala? Maybe you really want to work with this other nonprofit and you think it would be really effective for them to see you in action. So maybe you ask if, as part of your compensation, not instead of it, but as part of it, if you can extend the invitation to 3 or 4 other people to attend. And these other people are not your friends necessarily. These are potential business connections that you want to make. That's what I mean by using every opportunity to kind of strategically lead to the next one. It takes some forethought and some thinking through, and you will screw this up at least 100 times in the first couple of years of your career, and that's okay. But as you keep getting better and better at connecting your own dots, it'll be easier to spot how you can be strategic about those opportunities. That is a good thing to do all the time, and it's really good to be doing right now when opportunities are going to be scarce and when it's going to be important to strategically make these connections so that you can lay the groundwork and be as efficient as possible. So as you're thinking about evaluating these new options, definitely make sure what you're thinking about is something those you serve value right now. I have 2 examples here at the bottom of interesting things that different groups have been doing. One group I was talking with and working with, they are a musical group. They were including, or they were offering virtual performances, and they ended up partnering with a local, it was a wine restaurant or a wine retail shop. And so the wine shop delivered like a little collection of cheese and crackers and a bottle of wine to whoever bought a ticket to this virtual concert. And so the wine retailer was thrilled. They were able to make some money on selling these little concert box sort of enjoyment moments, right? And then the musicians really enjoyed that it was helping to create this special experience. Also, a performance is never really a performance right now, right? There's an opportunity to engage with the audience, to have a an ongoing dialogue, maybe even a talkback as part of a performance. If you regularly perform with chamber groups, you might be really comfortable with this. If you don't, this might be a new thing for you, but that private access is something that individuals really appreciate, especially in a virtual setting. Another option is let's pretend you want to approach your local grocer because they are doing well right now and you want them to sponsor some sort of performance you're doing, or maybe you want them to sponsor lessons for kids who are out of school and need something to do right now, right? So maybe some sort of sponsorship includes money for you to fund this particular program you're thinking about, but could it also involve some sort of private concert for the grocery store employees who have been working really hard lately, right? That's what I kind of mean by these kind of holistic sponsorships, where the companies are supporting creative efforts and also supporting their own employees through something the creative individuals are providing, right? Don't do this for free. Make sure that is sort of a holistic package you're putting together and you're getting compensated for your performance time and your programmatic time and your teaching time and everything else. But think about interesting ways to make sure your sponsor is getting something a little unique out of this as well. And then one of my favorite ideas of sort of using an opportunity to lead to something else actually came from a dance group. So any of you multimedia musicians out there may have experience collaborating with other performing artists. This dance company was very clear that they did not want to move their programming online. And that's okay. They made the decision that that did not make sense for them, and they're allowed to do that. But they did still want to connect with their audience in some way. So they came up with this idea of creating a digital care package. And the way it works is some person can pay $25 and that request goes to the dance company. And then the dance company essentially subcontracts one of their dancers to create a quick 30 to 45 second piece that is then recorded and delivered to someone. And then it's delivered via email along with a personalized message from the dancer that says something like, hey, Elaine, your mom thought you would really enjoy seeing this today, so we created this quick number for you inspired by these 3 words or something, right? It's nice. It's a wonderful way to connect. It has worked really well for this particular dance company. And as we were sort of brainstorming around what this would look like, we wanted to be really intentional about thinking about how it could then leverage to future things. So one way is to include an ask at the end of the digital care package that says something like, we hope you enjoyed this so much. Click here to send a digital care package to someone else, right? So it's really easy to translate the recipient of something into the purchaser of something. Also, there's a whole lot of recorded collateral that is part of this. So it makes sense to use that recorded collateral in some way. Obviously, we're not compromising confidentiality or anything like that. But if you've got all this recorded collateral, what can you do with it to make an interesting Instagram story? What can you do to repurpose it on YouTube or to repurpose it into some sort of package that you're then using to apply for some sort of grant, right? You can also share this idea with a key sponsor. Maybe you received the sponsorship from the grocery store and you say, thank you so much for supporting our educational programs. Did you also know we're doing these digital care packages? Maybe you want to send some to your best clients or your best customers, right? You're leveraging all of those relationships in a really authentic way that makes sense. So that's my long spiel about being creative in funding right now. And so with all that creativity in mind, I want to bring it back to our 5 budgeting steps. Remember, we defined the parameters, we listed all of our expenses in words, we quantified them, then we got real creative in figuring out how to fund all of those expenses. And the last step is to make your budget work. Your budget works when your income equals or exceeds your expenses. So obviously this person's budget does not work. They're planning on $4,000 worth of income and $5,000 worth of expenses for July of 2020. This doesn't work. It's not sustainable. It might be reality, but what's happening behind the scenes is this person is still spending $5,000. So they are getting that extra $1,000 either from a credit card. They're essentially borrowing to fund those expenses, or they're using their own savings to supplement the shortfall. That's okay if you're going to choose to do it on purpose, but make sure you're doing that on purpose and then adjust your budget so that you're showing exactly where you're getting that income from. The ways to think about how to make this budget work are obviously to spend less. And that tends to be where people start, right? Because it feels like it's more under our control to cut expenses rather than making more money. But I would encourage you to also explore if it's possible to make more money. It's really hard to cut more expenses in the arts. Almost no one I work with has a spending problem. Most people have an income problem. They're not earning enough money, right? And there are a long list of systemic reasons why this is true, right? And so solutions to that are either adjust your rates so that you're making more money, which may be possible for you and it may not be, or identify additional ways of earning money or seeking contributions to support what you do, right? So you can spend less, you can make more, or you can change the parameters. Remember, that's where we started. What are you budgeting? If you're budgeting for a residency you want to do this summer, well, could you postpone it until next summer, giving yourself a little bit more time to either raise the money or earn the money to make it feasible? Maybe that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't. If you're thinking about a particular performance you want to do, is it possible to do it with fewer musicians, maybe a chamber group instead of a slightly larger chamber group? That's up to you, but that's an option for making your budget work. You can spend less, make more, or change the parameters. And those three solutions line up perfectly with the definition of budgeting. Because remember, a budget is a financial plan for allocating resources. 3 parts to that definition, 3 potential areas you can adjust and change. And then all of that is expressed through that 5-step process where we start with the plan, the parameters, we list our expenses in words and we quantify them. Then we figure out how we're going to fund those expenses. And then we revisit all 3 of those steps so that we can make the budget work. Another question I've been getting lately is about sort of, okay, long term, yeah, I'm going to be fine, which I think is great. I hope everyone is fine in the long term. But people are also facing some very severe cash flow needs right now that won't necessarily be solved by additional students that you'll have next summer or something like that. So if that feels true for you, definitely pay attention to any emergency sources of funding that exist right now. I mentioned artistrelief.org. Your local cities and areas and maybe your community foundations are also providing emergency relief, particularly to creative individuals. I definitely look at the city level and the community foundation level for some of that support. I mentioned the stimulus money. If you've gotten that, that's fantastic. If you are someone who is in the unemployment queue, that might be a good option for you right now as well, especially as we're looking at sort of the long-term impacts of that. So focusing short term might mean really focusing on keeping your cash under control as much as possible. So that's our content for the day. We went over the 5-step budgeting process, particularly in this context where we are right now. I hope you are now able to apply it to build some sort of business or personal budget that makes sense for you. And my dream for you is that you can use it to connect to a big picture goal you have, either in the short term or in the long term, and that's okay. I will stick around and answer a couple of questions if there are any more coming in the chat. You can also feel free to shoot me an email with any follow-up questions you might have. As Peter mentioned, I get to come back next Thursday and the Thursday after that to talk about even more aspects of money for musicians and for creative individuals. So thanks so much for letting me hang out with you for the day. And if you do have those questions, throw them into the chat.
Thanks so much, Elaine. This is really great. It's, it takes a lot of the mystery out of everything. I think people, like you said, music and composition and math really should all go together, but somehow we have this block against it in our minds because of the way we've been taught. I think, I remember thinking, who cares what speed the train is going leaving the station? I just don't care. But that doesn't help us once we have to deal with the realities of paying the bills. So
Yes. Yes. I am
great.
with you. I also don't care about the train, but I really do care about funding creativity so that you don't have to do anything you don't want to do creatively just for the money.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, it's looking like there's no questions coming in the chat. But like Elaine said, feel free to send her an email. She'll also be back the next 2 Thursdays in a row. Um, and please do join us for those. Those will both be at 1:30, and those will all use the same Zoom meeting ID. Um, we will be posting this shortly on our website too. So if you want to refer back to any of the things that she was talking about, you'll be able to do that. Yeah, this is great. Math
Yay.
can be fun. And it takes, I think you're taking a lot of the panic out of things. It's really good to know that basically nobody knows what's happening right now, and that's okay. So hopefully we have some more tools to deal with that uncertainty right now. So thanks so much. We'll see you next Thursday.
That sounds great. Enjoy the rest of the sessions this afternoon, everyone. We'll see you again soon.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.